This is special Connecticut election coverage from WSHU Public Radio. I'm Larry Rifkin. Today we have an analysis of Democratic and Republican gubernatorial primary debates held this week at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield. With us are the panelists from both debates: WSHU senior political reporter Ebong Udoma, Hearst political reporter Kaitlyn Krasselt, and we also have from Hearst, Connecticut, a columnist and reporter, Ken Dixon, who also moderated the debates. Let's get right to it. Ken, let me start with you. It seemed to me that in this first debate that was held at Sacred Heart University, that the frontrunner, Mark Boughton, was kind of given a pass by the others. They were attacking each other. And is that a good strategy, or am I missing something that went on during that debate?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think they were probably missing the opportunity to go after Boughton, and instead the lesser known candidates, Bob Stefanowski of Madison and David Stemmerman of Greenwich, decided to go after each other. And they've got enough money, so maybe they want to cover their bases and attack each other, as well as spend a lot of money on TV commercials.
Do either of them have enough heft in terms of the public's knowledge of who they are and what they're for to really rail against the other candidate?
I think they've been up on TV while the other three were waiting for their grants. So I'd say a fair amount of people, Fox readers or Fox viewers, know who they are, but they're kind of outside the base's interest, I think. That's why it's super interesting. A five-way primary is super interesting.
Ebong, as you have followed this particular race, do you see anybody hitting their rhetorical stride? Do you see any new wrinkles in terms of what they were talking about just the other day that gives you a sense into the perspectives that these candidates are now taking?
I don't think any one of them did anything differently from what they've been doing before. Stemmerman and Stefanowski are going after each other, and they have a lot of money to do this. And as Ken said, Boughton is trying to stay above the fray. He doesn't want to get muddied, and he believes he's a front runner, and he has to try and protect that position. Someone who has been punching all along is Trumbull former first selectman Tim Hearst, and he kept up that. So I don't think they did anything differently this time than they've done in the past.
And Kaitlyn, you were there, you were asking questions. What happened to Steve Upsitnik during this particular debate? He seemed to be overshadowed.
Yeah, well, unfortunately for Steve, you have David Stemmerman and Bob Stefanowski who are going after each other. I don't know if it's because their last names are similar or if it's because they're both, self-funding their campaigns as business guys. And then you have frontrunner Mark Boughton, so he's a target. And as he said, Tim is always throwing shots, so that kind of just leaves Steve Upsitnik out there.
Well, what about the insider-outsider paradigm that we have here? Ken, it was interesting that they were attacking some of the candidates, the record of Tim Hearst, questioning whether he had tax increases or decreases, and yet everything that Mark Boughton said about his city being the most livable and the like, none of that got taken to account.
They probably didn't have enough time because with five people, it eats up a lot of time. I mean, he is the endorsed candidate. He's kind of low-key. Kaitlyn's right. Steve Upsitnik's kind of lost in the noise going on at the lower end of the spectrum of people who are aware. I mean, somebody made a point. I think it was Mark. He said when being accused of them being outsiders and he being an insider, he's right. At this point, there are 5 insiders running for the nomination.
And Ebong, do you see this insider-outsider issue as having any particular relevance in this campaign, given the Trump victory and using that kind of lever to say, I wasn't part of the problem in Connecticut?
I think I think Trump actually hurts being an outsider and that doesn't really do that much for you after the example of Trump on the national level. So even though there seems to be a general theme of outsider versus insider, I don't see any of them really making traction using that tactic.
And Kaitlyn, anything you want to add to this conversation?
No, I completely agree. They're at this point, they might as well all be insiders.
Well, let's talk about an issue that certainly has been on people's lips during this campaign. We'll move on to the state income tax. All of the candidates have concerns with it, but only 2 want to repeal it. We'll hear from all of the candidates, and we'll start with the endorsed candidate, Mark Boughton, who joined thousands of fellow Republicans on state capitol grounds to rally against the tax when it was implemented 27 years ago.
You know why it was a bad idea? Because they're going to take your money, they're never going to implement the cap that was supposed to go with it, and you're going to keep cranking that up and keep spending more money. And that's exactly what happened.
I'm the only person on this stage that has both introduced a plan to get rid of the state income tax and signed a firm pledge to not raise taxes as long as I am governor of Connecticut.
I would support it, but I think we have to earn our way in that direction. That's why in my 5-step plan to build 300,000 jobs, step 1 addresses spending, step 2 cost of living here. The personal income tax comprises half of our receipts, half of them. The idea that we're going to eliminate them is a fantasy. And it is the same kind of empty promise that has led our government to now being in a position where we are at risk of defaulting on our debt.
So I'm in favor of eliminating taxes, but I'm not going to increase other taxes for the sake of eliminating other taxes, because at the end of the day, no matter what pocket it comes from, taxpayers pay.
Kaitlyn, how clear do you think the candidates made their position on the income tax? And do you think that people are still imagining the realistic possibility that we would be able to eliminate it, or have they written that off?
I think they made it clear that they do or do not want to cut the income tax, but I don't think they made it clear how they would replace that revenue and what they would do instead.
Ebong?
Well, the thing about it is that you have to realize that pretty much they're playing to the Republican base. And cutting taxes is like catnip to Republicans. And so it's understandable why they would make pledges not to have any new taxes. And every single election that we have had since the income tax was introduced in Connecticut, there have been Republicans campaigning on getting rid of the income tax. So that's not what I thought was interesting here was Stemmerman and Herbst seemed to be much more practical about dealing with this issue and more realistic. But they're playing to a Republican base in the primary, so that's an issue that Republicans respond to.
Should it surprise us, Ken, that one insider, Mark Boughton, is running on repealing the tax, as is one of the outsiders? Has Mark Boughton said that in the past? He's run for this office before.
Well, he's been talking about it throughout. He's been kind of hedging, talking about a 10-year phase out. I was at the Capitol that year. You know, there were 40,000, not 20,000 people, and there were Republicans and independents and Democrats in that crowd. I mean, Connecticut took it hard, but they had the fig leaf of the spending cap, which has been illusory at best, and half the revenue. It's going to be really, really hard. I don't know what Stefanowski would do. They would probably blow up the unions for sure, especially if they get Republican takeover in the House and Senate, which the more Trump talks, the less likely it appears to be.
Kaitlyn, when you look at this particular race and you look at Stefanowski and you look at Stemmerman, as you said, even the names, the alliteration, a lot of people are going to be confused. How much attention do you think people are paying to this race? And should they really focus on any one particular issue or one candidate at this moment who may be making some strides that we may not, if we're not following this closely, even see?
Should people follow or the other candidates?
No, should people really be focusing on, any one of these candidates as making strides and any particular issue that you think may rise to the top over the next 2 weeks?
Yeah. I think they have the disadvantage, first of all, of having an August primary. I think a lot of people just aren't paying attention right now, except for those very devoted primary voters and the people who are around in the summer. As far as who's making headway, I think we said earlier the people who've been on TV, maybe, but how much credit do you give that? I don't know.
Well, the people who are on TV, of course, they are the outsiders who are self-funders, and they're having a lot of impact perhaps in Fairfield County.
Actually, they're all on TV. And on the Republican side, every one of them is on TV.
But substantially, the ones who are buying a lot of time.
Who have been on TV longer are the outsiders.
Right. And what is that impact? Is it in Fairfield County, do you think, primarily, or do you think it's going to be more important even to see what kind of ground games they have across the state of Connecticut?
We've had candidates in Connecticut who have spent a lot of money on TV and haven't won several times. And so it doesn't necessarily translate because you spend more money on TV that you will win. As far as the ground game is concerned, especially for a primary election where very few people are going to turn up, your ground game is going to make the difference.
When we look at candidates from the outside, Connecticut Republicans can have had the tendency to want to bring them forward as their nominees. We saw Mr. Foley last time. We've seen Linda McMahon. And, putting Donald Trump aside for the moment, just in the state of Connecticut, is that a plus for some of these outsiders? Or given the experience, is that possibly a reason to look to an insider?
The twisted part of me is rooting for, let's say the Democrat self-funder against the Republican Citizens Election Fund candidate, just to see how the shoe fits on the other foot. But
the reason why you're saying that is because the Republicans were against public financing of campaigns.
Yeah, they're all against public financing until
and
they
now
take
to
it.
have
Yeah,
a Republican
right.
emerge who's being publicly financed against a Democrat who's privately financing his campaign would be quite.
Well, I
quite
mean, the
something.
primary voters are going to decide whether they want to go with that person, right? The dark horse for me is Steve Obsitnik. Very thoughtful, moderate. He surprised everybody at the convention. He's got some real pros. They've been doing a lot of door knocking in the last couple of weeks while they were waiting for their money, and he could be a good candidate, but that he's kind of lost in the noise. But that would be the dark horse.
Well, there was a lot of tension at this particular debate, and it reached a height when Stemmerman attacked Stefanowski on his business background and his tax plan. Stefanowski responded with some strong words. Here is the ensuing back and forth.
You know why employee funds like the state of Connecticut are bankrupt right now? Because people like you trade in their stock, living in mansions in Greenwich with thousands of bathrooms, losing money for the people in the pension plans. That's why we are where we are. You're proud of your record, David, skimming money off of trading stocks and having pension plans all across the country be bankrupt because of it. I'm very comfortable with my track record in the private sector. Thank you.
Thanks for not applauding, folks. Okay, how about one more rejoinder, and then we can move on.
I promise I won't punch back again. So, Bob, you may not have remembered, but this is a Republican primary. And in a Republican primary, we actually celebrate success. In a Republican Party, we believe in free enterprise. We believe in investing people's capital and generating a return. We don't toss out epithets from a poll-tested claims about disparaging people because they've been successful. The success I've earned. It's exactly that kind of success that I look to bring to everybody here in our state.
Given that exchange, Ken, getting back to your point about Steve Obsitnik, and maybe there's an opening for him, is this where that opening comes? People concerned that these two are really battling each other with negatives, and maybe they're looking for an alternative to the insiders, but not those two gentlemen.
Well, from what I'm hearing among people who don't want to be on the record, more than half of the potential voters are undecided. Less than 3 weeks to go. So the last 10 days is going to be crucial. They're all going to, all the commercials are going to wash. So people are waiting for something to break. To me, Tim Herbst is the one who's all over the state, Malloy style, every day, doing something. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Ebong?
About what? Who's going to emerge?
No, Steve Obsitnik. Does he have an opportunity
Oh,
here?
okay. I don't know. I mean, probably Ken has more insight than me on this.
Well, he's a naval veteran. He's got his, Silicon Valley bona fides going on.
But how well is he known?
He came out of nowhere to get, on the primary ballot via the convention.
So, because this is an insider's game. Primaries are definitely an insider's game. And that's why we have the party-endorsed candidate as being considered the front runner in this race. It's anybody's guess, and I guess Ken has better insight than me as far as this is concerned.
Kaitlyn, has anybody drawn clear distinction between them and the current administration and the way that things are being done in Hartford? Do you think anybody's given that clear light and path where they are really drawing that distinction in very bright terms?
Between the current administration and the Republicans?
Right. I mean, any Republican who's really given very practical answers as to what they would do very differently?
I think, gosh, I don't know. Would you say Steve, maybe?
I mean, they all want to blow up the state unions to one way or another.
But as far as practical answers, I don't know if we're getting practical answers at this point in the process.
The
right?
answers they've been practical. They've been practically answers.
Yeah. Exactly. They're practically
Hardly
answers.
Well, the question is, what's going to have to happen for somebody to break out of the pack over the next 2 weeks? What are they going to have to respond to? Are there issues like tolls or casinos, which have entered into the Democratic race, that will now enter into the Republican race? Is anybody finding
Can I
their
say something here? I don't think any of that has anything to do with what's going to happen on August 14th.
So
I think what's going to make the difference on August 14th is who has the best ground game, who's going to bring out, because there are not that many voters that are coming out.
Yeah, exactly.
You can actually talk to almost every voter that will come out that
Well,
day.
who benefits? Is it the party-endorsed candidate?
So who has the ability to get their people to the polls? That's what it comes down to. And who has the best organization across the state to do that? I think that's what's going to
Well,
determine.
how strong then is the pull of the Republican Party under J.R. Romano to be able to get out the vote for Mark Boughton? And then let me ask the other question about the petitioning candidates. They had to go out and get all those petitions. Are those names that can benefit them in the course of the next couple of weeks?
Well, the person who's going to win is the person who's got the list of regular primary voters and has contacted them, which is why I think somebody like Obsitnik with a smart inner core could pull off something. I mean, Mark Boughton's depending on his position on the ballot, and being the party.
And run that down for us, Ken. It's going to be in alphabetical order?
Oh, I knew you'd ask me that. Caitlin, you saw the ballot.
I saw a sample ballot this morning. I don't know, what if it's going to change or what, but the ballot that I saw this morning, it's by row. The endorsed candidates are on row A, and then it goes down from there. I don't know how they're going to order the candidates because there's 5 of them after the endorsed candidate, but
the top of the line is the party endorsed candidate.
And that typically, for those going to the polls that haven't been paying attention but are turning out to vote, they're going to go with the top row.
That's the huge advantage.
Yeah.
Let me ask you to fill in the blank. Time or the lack of it is of benefit to?
I have no idea. Is of benefit to?
Well, if they had the primary today, I think, Herbst or Boughton would win.
Yeah.
But, we have colleagues who think Stefanowski's still
I've
ahead.
heard Stefanowski.
I think that's why the there's been so much of an attack on Stefanowski for not being a Republican. This is a race about Republicans. Why are you in this race?
Well, with the 11th commandment of Ronald Reagan, how is that particular issue playing between Stefanowski and Stemmerman, who's been a Republican longer or a Democrat longer, who gave to Chris Dodd? How does that play, Ken?
I don't think it plays too much, but I keep thinking about Stefanowski not going to the convention, but having the noisiest party, best catered party at Foxwoods that was like spilling into the press room across the way, and overindulged delegates like standing next to us watching the TV and yelling and stuff.
Yeah,
But
they were noisy, and there was a lot of them.
Right, but so did they remember
Very
him
well
after they
fed
woke
too,
up
right?
from the hangover?
Yeah.
From the hangover, yeah, well fed and well boozed up, but
Yeah.
yeah, they're over that. That's another reason why it's so interesting.
In this primary campaign, is somebody going to come out to vote against someone or for someone? Is there a great feeling of support for someone based on their own personal magnetism or their competency with the issues, or will they be voting against someone else?
I think it's really hard to vote against someone when you have 5 candidates.
It's easier, you think, on the Democratic side?
Yeah. I mean, you can vote against Joe Ganim by voting for Ned Lamont or vice versa.
Yeah, or vote against Stefanowski by voting for Hearst or Boughton. Yeah.
But it's a vote for anyone else would be a vote against Stefanowski.
Normally you have votes. Normally you have votes against when there's an incumbent. That's what drives people to say, okay, I don't like the incumbent, so I'm going to vote for whoever is opposing them.
Well, that's why I was asking, has anybody really drawn the best distinction between them and Dan Malloy as the counterweight to what has gone on?
In the Republican?
Yeah.
They're all voting against her.
No, but is there one candidate who's quintessentially...
Well, I mean, Herbst early on came out and said he'd return the death penalty. I mean, that's pretty antithetical to...
And he's talked about gun laws, too.
Yes,
Yeah.
I believe he's got the endorsement.
the NRA.
This morning.
release.
Are some of the social or cultural issues versus some of the money issues going to be important in this race among Republicans? Because oftentimes it does come down to a cultural issue as opposed to just straight economics, because they're all kind of saying the same thing about economics. Ebong, what do you think?
The cultural issues, as far the thing about it, if in the general election, that might be an issue, but in a Republican primary, they're all on the same page when it comes to.
Except Ken's been saying that Mr. Absitnik might be a little bit more moderate than some of the others.
I don't think their feet have been putting the fire on the woman's right to choose, right?
No.
They have. Not all of them have answered the question. Those
That's
that have
shocking.
answered the question have said in front of large audiences that you cannot win an election in Connecticut by being against a woman's right to choose. So they are at least aware of that, I guess. Whether or not they support a woman's right to choose is a different story.
All right, well, we are going to turn to the Democrats in just a moment, so please stay with us. Welcome back to this special debate coverage by WSHU Public Radio. Let's talk about the Democratic debate, and we'll start with the candidates trying to distance themselves from Governor Daniel P. Malloy. Take a listen to this exchange.
I believe he stands where I do on taking on the NRA as I fought for, to ban military-type assault weapons in Connecticut. We need to get that back nationally. I've been in that fight, too. I've also been one who's even gone beyond that and brought a lawsuit against the gun industry to make them adhere to what I would say is a better practice for smart guns. So anybody who wants to stand with me, Governor Malloy and others, on things that are important for safety for children and people of Connecticut, I'll give credit where credit is due. Now, we have very different styles.
Let me just say, first of all, 8 years ago, I was the guy that challenged Dan Malloy for governor. When I took him on, I said, if this state does not make fundamental changes in terms of how we deliver services, in terms of how we raise revenues, in terms of how we attract jobs and business to the state, we're going to be in the same mess in 2018 as we were in 2010. And we're still in that mess.
Now, I remind you that Ned Lamont, who just responded as the second person in, is the party-endorsed candidate. Joe Ganim, the mayor of Bridgeport, is not. Of course, he petitioned to get onto the ballot. So the question is, does he sound like a party-endorsed candidate, distancing himself from a lot of what goes on in Hartford? And what goes on in Hartford is basically with Democratic leadership.
This is not the first time that we've heard them try to distance themselves from Dan Malloy and what's happening in Hartford. Republicans have latched onto that, so they're using it as an attack point. Malloy is in a weird position where he's very unpopular, and it would actually probably be harmful to a candidate to endorse someone as a sitting governor. And I just want to point out that Ned brings up challenging Malloy 8 years ago, but Malloy hadn't been governor yet when he challenged him. So he wasn't challenging Malloy as an incumbent. He was challenging Malloy when he ran for the first time.
Ebong, how does this all strike you?
Well, it's to be expected. There are two people who are not on the ballot who are going to make a difference in this election, and that's Daniel Malloy and the President Trump, Donald Trump. And so Democrats cannot ditch Malloy, but at the same time do not want to embrace him. And Republicans cannot ditch Trump, and at the same time, they do not want to embrace him. So that's a dilemma they have. But it's a fine line for them, and they're going to keep, trying to play along, and hope that that will not be an issue when it comes to voting in November. But it's going to be an issue, whichever way you look at it. They're going to have to deal with that all the way through November.
Ken Dixon?
Well, Ganim smartly started talking about gun control. Certainly that Governor Malloy and the Sandy Hook shooting distinguished himself on many levels, from later pushing for better gun safety, but in the moment when nobody else would tell the parents and the families of that their kids weren't coming back to them, he took it on himself in the Sandy Hook firehouse, and it was apparently an incredible scene, and kind of early in his tenure, but arguably the high point of maybe the reason why he was, he became governor. So Joe was smart talking about gun control. Anybody, because it's taken two parties to get everybody, to get the budget in the ditch. There's all kinds of responsibility to go around. I mean, Malloy's right that it all started with Rowland in 1997 when he gave away the store, well, arguably gave away the store to the CBAC unions. That was 50,000 state employees. Other people think that unions are good for the economy because they raise wages for everybody, and I personally believe that. Okay, so I can just ramble on, but go ahead, Larry.
Ebong, as you look at how the governor himself has responded to this race, because you heard Joe Ganim basically saying that Dan Malloy has never been my friend, so don't blame me. And then, of course, Ned Lamont is the endorsed candidate, but he's saying things aren't going well either. Is the governor getting involved in any material way in this primary, or is he just stepping back, realizing that any role he plays is not a good one?
I don't know if this was done on purpose, but the fact that he passed a $10 million, he passed in the bonding commission $10 million to study highway tolls, that did not help at all. And I am sure he wanted that to be part of this debate in the election. So he's trying to find a way to kick up the sand.
Kaitlyn?
As far as whether or not Governor Malloy feels he has a role to play, I think he joked about it in the last day of the legislature this year that he like threatened to give someone his endorsement, and it was a
Republicans. He said he's willing to lend his support to any of the Republicans.
That was rare public wit.
And it was pretty funny. To his credit, he's.
Well, on this tolls issue, Ned Lamont, of course, did say that he was against the study and the $10 million, and Joe Ganim evidently did say, I read in print today, that he would likely favor it. Then he kind of pushed away, and Ned Lamont came after him on this. Does this toll issue have any resonance within the Democratic primary as you see it, and this toll study issue?
Tolls are something that I haven't covered a ton, but from what I hear from voters, it's something that they are opposed to because they, at the end of the day, they don't want to spend more money to get to work. A lot of people are working second jobs in other communities or even just their first job in a different community. So in the sense of whether or not it's important to voters, it is. It's very important.
But
As
what
far
about
as
finessing it with either saying, well, I want to study and then we'll see, or I just want it to be interstate. I just want to deal with the trucks. I mean, can somebody have it that finely cut?
I don't think you can get away with having it just on the trucks at the border.
Rhode Island just started it, and I got to see how that case goes. I mean, it's pretty, it's good, politics, kind of slicing.
Oh, the
things.
politics is great. You're not going to pay for it. Other people are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, truckers do pay, though, anyway.
No. For the average voter, you're not going to pay for it. It's someone else that's going to pay for it. That's basically the message that they're trying to say by, okay, it's just for truckers, not for you.
Yeah.
And Kaitlyn, you asked a very tough question, though it was said to be easy at the beginning, about the felonious past of Joe Ganim, and you laid it all out, just to remind people of the particulars that he was involved with. Is that issue getting a lot of attention during this campaign, or does it need to be brought up and revived? Is it still fresh in people's minds?
I don't know that it's still fresh in people's minds. I think we've all heard people say, oh, that's in the past. And he gets out in front of it. Every time I've heard him speak, he says, he in his opening statement, he didn't today, which I thought was odd, but in his opening statements, he normally addresses it. He normally says, I've made some mistakes. I've paid my dues. The people of Bridgeport put their faith back in me. That's his thing. But I don't think people really realize exactly what he did, which as an elected official is one of the worst things you can do. He violated the public trust, and I don't think people realize exactly to what degree he did that and for how long it was.
I mean, the fact that he's still standing just goes to the audacity that he has. Mm-hmm. I mean, he actually is extremely focused. And he works very hard at this. A lot of other people would have given up a long time ago, and he's been very dogged about it, and hasn't allowed this to hold him back at all.
Well, it's more fun going around the state, spending the money that you've raised than it is to, stay in the city and try to solve some of the problems, right?
Well, Ken, talk about the bankruptcy issue that you pressed him on as it relates to Bridgeport's past, and how clear you thought he was about his role in averting that.
Well, it was a Republican mayor, the last Republican mayor, who I covered and I wrote columns about, and it was an easy way out. She and her people thought more like her people. Mayor Moran, Mary Moran, thought it would be easier, and I don't think I can argue with Joe about the effect it might have, like blowing up pensions and the like. So, as far as fact checking, he's probably okay on that. Except when he says pulling them out of bankruptcy, they were never in bankruptcy, and he finally admitted that. And that took a while today.
What are his strengths? I mean, Ebong, we know what his weaknesses are. Is it really his stewardship of Bridgeport? He was invited back by the voters after that record of error and law breaking.
Yes. Well, the thing about it is that he's a very convincing talker. And you have to give it to him. He is ready to go out there and say what has to be said and confront people. And he did when he was first mayor. He did turn around the image of Bridgeport to a large extent. Because under Mary Moran, it was just like this was the end of the road. She had thrown up her hands and said, look, I can't, there's nothing I can do to save this situation. So for a young lawyer like Joe Ganim, you know, to come along and say, look, we can turn this around, and actually was able to do something to change the image of the city, it left its mark. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that he was allowed to come back. And I mean, it was a joke in the beginning, and then he won, you know, and people take him seriously.
Kaitlyn, to the response that Ned Lamont gave to that question, the tough one that you asked Joe Ganim, he was rather backing off and not really attacking on an issue that certainly could work to his advantage. How much is that him looking at the long game, recognizing that if he wins, which many people think the endorsed candidate will, that he's got to have the real active support of the Bridgeport Town Committee to have any chance of winning the governorship?
Yeah, I mean, the cities are the key to the election, right? That's kind of common knowledge. And he did back off. He said that Mayor Ganim should serve out his term serving the people of Bridgeport, which is not the first time someone has suggested that. And even yesterday, he told our colleague Dan Har that, you know, if the courts have determined that Joe Ganim can run for public office, then he should be eligible for public funding. So I think Ned is no dummy.
So he's been that relaxed about this issue
Yeah.
all the way along. What does that say about him as a retail politician? Is he better than perhaps some might think? Because I know he's been criticized for not having a lot of specifics and not being easily, embraced within the urban centers, and he's working on that. What do you say about Ned Lamont and his ability to attract votes ultimately?
I think he has a lot of work ahead of him. That is something that Joe Ganim is very good at, is connecting with people. For whatever reason, people seem to respond to him.
I think Joe seems,
Yeah.
even though he's so intense, he's a lot more comfortable
Yeah.
in doing this than Ned Lamont.
Yeah.
You can sense that Ned Lamont is a bit outside his comfort zone, and it's going to take a while for Ned to be able to be as relaxed in these environments. This is not his life. This has been Joe Ganim's life.
But it's also not the first time he's done it.
Well, it's not the first time he's done it, but think about it. He did it in 2006, and that's what people remember. Not even his run in 2010.
There's a very low bar in Bridgeport for Joe Ganim. I know people who he was in prison and everything that he had done was exposed and out there. The guys in prison and people with businesses on Park Avenue said, but he planted a tree in the little green area between the lanes, and I miss him.
The most recent poll that I saw from a nonprofit organization said that employment, health care, and taxes are on the minds of Connecticut voters. How much are they looking at those issues, saying that we really have a long way to go, we're behind many other states as it relates to, say, employment, and blame the Democrats? Is that really a mantle that any of these candidates, either the two of them, Ganim or Lamont, are going to have to take on as part of this experience for them?
Yeah, I think so. I moved to the state 3 years ago, and some of the first people I met who had lived here their entire lives, the first thing they said to me is how much they hated Malloy. And they couldn't really give me a good reason, but it just has to do with the fact that people feel slighted by the current government in Hartford. And I think Ned and Joe, whoever it ends up being, they're going to have to overcome that.
Republicans say, Ebong, this is their moment, is it?
It should be under normal circumstances, but we're not in normal times. The problem is that they have a headwind from Washington. That's the problem that the Republicans have. They have the tailwind locally and a headwind from Washington. And which one is going to play a bigger role in this election, we don't know yet. But under normal circumstances, Republicans have won the governorship in Connecticut several times, and it's and the two times that Malloy won was by the slimmest of margins. So there's an opportunity for a Republican to win the governorship in Connecticut. The problem is, right now the real headwinds coming out of Washington.
Malloy won by 6,000 the first time, 24,000 the second time. I'm assuming Ned's going to be the winner, and he's going to have a really, really hard time no matter who runs against him. I think the Democrats are in big trouble in the governor's residence, but I imagine that Trump is just going to prevent them from taking over the House and Senate at this point.
Ken, when you look at the fact that there are at least, well, now that Elizabeth Esty is not running again, but at one time perhaps 7 prominent Democrats who, if they had an interest in the governorship, would have had such an advantage in terms of identity and the like. How much do you think Democrats bemoan the fact that none of them wanted to take a shot at this?
Well, Dick Blumenthal, there's no better job than being U.S. Senator. I mean, so I think Jim Himes, anybody with half a brain would not run because it's a mess up there. I mean,
But
really,
even-
you have to question.
But even those in statewide office, like Comptroller Lembo, the problem is that people are so disgusted with what's going on in Hartford right now. And
it's easy to blame Malloy.
it's very easy. The Malloy has been the foil for quite a while now. But if you notice, the bipartisan budget that was passed last year was in trouble even before they finished signing it. So, it's a mess. It's a real mess. And but I think of a situation like what happened in California before Jerry Brown came back. And it was like no one could run California. It was just a mess. Nothing could be done. And Jerry Brown came and turned it around. How did that happen? So I believe it can be done with the right person, but right now it is a tough job.
Well, let's take a look at the Democrats and the way they address the issue of taxes here in the state of Connecticut. They had some ideas, too, a little bit different concerns than the Republicans.
Easiest place for a politician to go when they're looking for or elected official is, we're short on revenues, a terrible situation, let's just raise the mill rate. Let's just raise the taxes. I've taken just the opposite view. That's the last place to go when it has an impact. The places I'd like to see reduced first and foremost is the most regressive tax that hurts the people who have the least ability to pay, and that's property taxes.
Yeah, Kaitlyn, politicians never tell the truth about taxes. When Joe was reelected, the first thing he did was he raised the mill rate 29%. We've got Republican candidates for governor. They always say, I'm going to eliminate the income tax. You heard that from Roland. You're hearing that from these guys now. That's $9 billion. That's half the revenues the state needs to survive on. They're just not telling you the truth. And you know what that would do? Is Joe is absolutely right. The property tax is the tax that most penalizes middle-class people in this state, and the middle class is getting slammed.
There he is. The middle class is getting slammed in Connecticut, even though it's his party that's in control. Fact check that about the increases in taxes in Bridgeport.
I think Ken would be better suited for that.
He was claiming that he was reducing the mill rate, and that did occur, but the grand list increased, so taxes actually rose. Yeah.
As you look at their responses about the property tax, you haven't been around here that long, but Ken, you and I can both attest to the fact that we've been talking about property tax reform in Connecticut for 30 years. Likely, unlikely? Ken?
Ooh, I mean, it's easy to say unlikely, but I'd like to think that we've got a chance to elect a governor and a legislature that can actually do something about it and help the inner city schools. And I mean, if you own a house in Bridgeport, it's like the taxes are. I mean, David Walker, who briefly ran for governor, his place in Black Rock is like $37,000 a year in taxes. I mean, it's a nice house, got a view of Long Island Sound. But that's about what.
Does he have a boat to get out?
That's a good question. That's about the per capita income. I think it's a little less than the per capita income in the city. Yeah.
But does anything about that motor vehicle capping in the inner cities tell us anything about our resolve to really deal with property taxes?
Yeah.
Well, even before you deal with property taxes, we have a deficit problem that no one has been able to get a hold of. I mean, we had when Malloy came in, he said that would be the one thing that he would tackle, and he's leaving office 8 years later, and we still have a deficit. We have unfunded liabilities that that has made it so that one of the things Malloy said he would do was to make sure that all our liabilities would be funded. We're still not quite there yet.
Yeah, but he's invested more than the previous 3 governors combined.
That's what I'm saying. So those are systematic problems that we have, systemic problems, rather, I should say, and those are the issues that will affect any new governor and any new legislature.
And Kaitlyn, you tried to get a really direct response to this issue of unfunded liabilities. Make it clearer for us. Did you hear anything in their conversation that gives us a sense of where they're about to go on that if they're elected?
No, I didn't. Did you?
No, but this is primary stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, we have all fall to start getting.
But I think the root of the question was, the unfunded liabilities are a huge problem. Huge. It's, what did I say, $127 billion, something along those lines, and so the idea that you have to go to the table with labor is, definitely something that they've acknowledged. But my question was, do you think that the unions need to make concessions in order to help stabilize the economy? And I didn't really get an answer on that.
Ebong, what did you hear?
Well, I didn't expect to hear.
But aren't they going to have to answer that?
From Republicans, yes, you'd hear them talk about that. But from Democrats need labor in the election. So they're definitely not going to be talking about that now.
Well, Ned Lamont has said that he really is labor's guy, but can he address these issues and still say that?
Well, we had it with Malloy. Malloy said, look, I am a Democrat, so I will be able to sit down with labor. He had 2 rounds, two rounds of negotiations, and he got a lot of concessions, but the Republicans said that was not enough.
Thank you for joining us for an analysis of the Connecticut Democratic and Republican gubernatorial primary debates held this week at Sacred Heart University and presented by the university along with WSHU Public Radio and the Hearst, Connecticut Media Group. My thanks to our panelists, Ebong Udoma of WSHU, Kaitlyn Krasselt of Hearst, Connecticut Media, and Ken Dixon from Hearst, Connecticut Media. Remember, there is still time to register with a party in advance of the primaries. For WSHU Public Radio, I'm Larry Rifkin.